It's great to be here. Thank you also to the George Washington University Competition and Innovation Lab for inviting me to join you all today. I've noticed in recent years we seem to be having more and more antitrust conferences. Obviously, I support increased output, so I think this is great. I'm glad to see more people discussing antitrust, especially outside the ABA spring meeting. We had some more options, so glad you're all here and doing this, and I appreciate your efforts. As this administration continues to lay out our approach to antitrust enforcement, I thought I would take the opportunity to address a few myths that have become unfortunately common, some myth busting about trust busting, if you will. I have 5 substantive myths in mind and then 1 high-level policy misperception. Myth number 1, that antitrust is regulation. This one is a personal pet peeve of mine. It is unfortunately very common to see not just the press, who I can almost excuse, but even some practitioners refer to antitrust regulation or antitrust regulators. The problem is that simply is not a thing. Antitrust is law enforcement, period, full stop. Not only is enforcement of the antitrust laws not regulation, when properly undertaken, antitrust enforcement can prevent the need for regulation in the first place. Vigorously enforcing the antitrust laws to promote and protect competitive markets, if successful, helps us to avoid the very sorts of distorted or broken markets that invite intrusive government regulation. By preventing market failures, antitrust is actually a deregulatory tool. As this administration pursues its deregulatory agenda, antitrust enforcement will have a key role to play in helping to maintain the market conditions that obviate the need for regulation by promoting fair competition. Myth number 2, vertical integration is always pro-competitive. Vertical integration is often pro-competitive. In many cases, it reflects legitimate growth and investment, but it does not guarantee competitive outcomes, nor does the potential for efficiency gains fully explain why some firms pursue it. Much of the traditional framework for analyzing vertical integration comes from physical industries, like manufacturing, where integration often yields real efficiencies, reduced transaction costs, economies of scale, stable supply, and asset coordination. In these settings, switching suppliers required retooling factories or reorganizing logistics. In many modern markets, however, the dynamics are different. In digital markets, for example, software is oftentimes modular, adaptable, and interoperable by design. Integration rarely reflects physical constraint. When it leads to foreclosure, it is more likely the product of strategic design and contractual leverage, efforts to raise switching costs or lock out rivals. In short, moat building. Integration that blocks third-party access or suppresses rival alternatives under the guise of product improvement demands scrutiny. Vertical integration can also create conflicts of interest. When a firm controls both infrastructure and the applications on top of it, for example, it can structure interfaces, ranking systems, or data flows to favor its own offerings, not because they are better, but because it shapes the rules. These advantages operate through information asymmetries, contractual commitments, and opaque design choices that degrade competition while often remaining invisible to users. Myth number 3, innovation can justify exclusion. In antitrust debates, innovation is too often treated not as one economic metric that can be used to apply law to facts, but a floating abstraction, a sweeping defense that excuses exclusionary conduct and avoids scrutiny by reframing anything on the path to dominance and power as progress. This focus on ends without considering means is not a defense of innovation. It is a veiled attempt to abandon the rule of law. Genuine innovation flourishes when firms compete on the merits, when better products win by attracting users, not by blocking alternatives. Yet today, firms often point to past innovations, R&D budgets, or engineering talent, as if these alone justify their business practices, even when those practices rely on default arrangements, coercive contracts, or restrictive product design. We saw this logic in a recent Wall Street Journal editorial, which dismissed concerns about search defaults by citing Google's investment in product development. But 49 states and United States Department of Justice, under both Republican and Democratic leadership, did not bring an antitrust case because Google invested in R&D. They challenge the company's use of contractual defaults to block rivals' access to all other meaningful distribution channels that could be used to reach users. This kind of framing creates a false dilemma at the heart of the kitchen sink innovation defense, that enforcers must choose between enforcing the law and supporting innovation. But that choice is illusory. The central question for antitrust enforcers is distinguishing between competition on the merits and unfair methods of competition, whether in the form of collusion or exclusion. When exclusionary tactics are justified on the grounds that a firm once innovated in the past, we don't reward innovation, we weaponize it to suppress the very rivalry that is supposed to drive continued innovation. Antitrust enforcement should protect the conditions that allow innovation to thrive. That means distinguishing genuine product improvements from conduct that forecloses alternatives. It means recognizing that true innovation invites challenge. It doesn't depend on lock-in. And it means rejecting the suggestion that past success grants any firm a perpetual exemption from the rules of fair competition. Myth number 4, we need national champions to compete with China. There's a familiar argument that often resurfaces when a large incumbent faces scrutiny, that antitrust enforcement threatens America's global position, that weakening our biggest companies would hand the future to China. We're told to protect so-called national champions, even when it entails limiting the freedom of Americans to build, compete, and speak. But the irony is hard to ignore. Some of the very firms warning that enforcement would harm US competitiveness are investing millions in research partnerships, AI collaborations, and data ventures that directly advance China's technological capabilities. They invoke national security as a shield against domestic accountability while deepening ties with China abroad. That's not economic patriotism, that's hedging your bets. Americans deserve businesses that are all in for us. The deeper flaw in the national champion model is that it conflates market power with competitiveness. America's commercial leadership didn't come from using the levers of government to consolidate economic power into the hands of a few firms. It came from open markets, fair competition, and the belief that progress flows from preserving the conditions for liberty and human flourishing, not central planning and abdication of law enforcement. When policymakers defer to powerful firms under the banner of national security, they achieve the opposite by insulating these actors in ways that make the American economy less competitive and our supply chains less secure. Even China, the country referred to most often in putting forward this myth, is shifting course. Its own development strategy increasingly emphasizes market diversification and competition among multiple firms in facilitating production rather than reliance on state-favored giants. China is trying to unlock the same dynamism that made America successful. It would be a grave mistake to abandon our principles just as our others begin to adopt them. We won't beat China by copying China. America wins when we remember the principles that make America great: free enterprise, competition, and the idea that no firm is above the law. Strength comes not from shielding incumbents, but from protecting industrial liberty and freedom to compete for innovators, entrepreneurs, workers, and the next great challenger whose name we don't yet know. Antitrust enforcement is not about facilitating anarchistic power grabs. It is economic realism rooted in our shared national history of free enterprise and economic competition. Myth number 5, structural remedies are an extreme measure. There's a common claim that structural remedies, such as breakups, are too aggressive, too disruptive, or too uncertain when used to address exclusionary conduct. That antitrust should limit itself to fine-tuning behavior through settlements or ongoing oversight and avoid touching market structure. We are told that breakups will harm efficiency and hamper innovation. There it is again. But history tells a different story. Last year, GE voluntarily broke itself up into 3 different companies. The result was not lost efficiency, but actually better products and services that unlocked even greater shareholder value. The breakup of AT&T didn't stifle innovation, it turbocharged it. It cleared the way for new technologies, new business models, and new competitors across telecom and computing. Removing structural barriers didn't create chaos. It reopened pathways for rivalry and renewal that had been artificially suppressed. These experiences reveal a deeper truth. In many cases, firm structure isn't just the backdrop for exclusionary conduct, it's the product of it. In dynamic markets, firms don't just gain market share, they reshape the marketplace itself. But after acquiring market power, they often then lock in users, foreclose rivals, and construct ecosystems that reinforce their position. In these contexts, structural remedies aren't a rejection of free markets. They are a way of restoring them. They work to undo durable barriers created by exclusion, reopening competition on the merits and giving innovation a chance to reemerge. Of course, not every case requires structural relief, but when exclusion has produced structural lock-in that is difficult to unwind, behavioral conditions may not be enough. Restoring competition sometimes requires restoring the conditions under which competition can occur, especially when the harm is embedded in architecture, defaults, or control over distribution. Structure is not off limits when structure becomes the source, amplifying the problem. Myth number 6, which is more of a high-level policy issue, that conservative support for antitrust enforcement is just sour grapes over censorship. There's a widely held belief that conservatives' renewed interest in antitrust enforcement is little more than frustration over big tech censorship. If the speeches that Assistant Attorney General Slater and I gave last week weren't enough, allow me to disabuse you of that notion now. Treasury Secretary Bessent recently put it well. MAGA doesn't stand for Make M&A Great Again. This administration is committed to advocating for the interests of Main Street, and that means protecting competition across the economy. Technology platforms and products are a vital part of our daily life and therefore incredibly important, but so too are markets like groceries, healthcare, and energy. When I worked in the Senate, I heard more than one lobbyist say something to the effect of, if we allow them to enforce the antitrust laws against big tech, then they'll do it in every industry. To which I can only respond, God willing. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mark. It was a fantastic speech. So I'm Aurélien Portuez, the research professor and founding director of the GW Competition and Innovation Lab. And we strive for these kind of thought leaderships and these kind of contribution to the antitrust literature. And Mark has been, for many years now, at the leading for the thinking and implementation of antitrust. I remember some years ago we organized precisely at GW as part of the Regulatory Studies Center a conference on Schumpeterian competition and all this discussion about innovation. And I was really struck by the clarity and the richness of your address. And I think we can all see today that you can be a very promising FTC commissioner leading this thought leadership. So again, congrats on your confirmation by the US Senate. It's a great pleasure to have you. So Mark has a background on philosophy from the University of Chicago, as a GED from the University of Houston Law Center. He has worked both at the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ's Antitrust Division. He has worked in Congress for Senator Mike Lee. So Mark is uniquely placed to know both antitrust agencies, Congress, and brings with that a wealth of experience. So perhaps you can tell us more about your education and how these philosophical principles that you ground, how it is so important to come back to antitrust philosophy and obviously conservative philosophy and going, not denying economics or the technical aspect of antitrust, but also bringing it back to a moralistic approach to antitrust. How is your education and philosophy inspiring on the day-to-day thinking of antitrust?
Sure, thank you, I appreciate that. So as you mentioned, I have a background in philosophy, just undergraduate degree. I always get worried saying that there's gonna be like a philosophy PhD in the room. They're gonna quiz me on something. But yeah, so that, I focused a lot on classic philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, and so that informs a lot of my thinking, and have done a lot of reading and time spent thinking about sort of conservative political philosophy. When I went to law school, I got to my second year, and that's the first chance you have to choose classes that aren't sort of the standard, and took antitrust honestly on a little bit of a whim, vaguely aware of what it was. but immediately fell in love with it. Just really enjoyed the type of thinking that goes into it, the fact that every case is different. You have to jump into someone else's business and learn it as well as or better than they know it. Really appreciate those kinds of challenges. But also the policy questions that underlie it really comes down to the structure of the economy, the structure of industries, and whether they're operating in ways that are actually conducive to national economic health. And this, when I was studying, so this would have been 2009-ish, somewhere around there in the middle of law school. The economy was in the tank, right? So we were going through a recession. We'd had the housing bubble, and things had fallen apart right when I went to law. It was a great time to go to law school and then try to get a job as a lawyer. And so a lot of this was top of mind, as sort of issues of economic fairness and whether our economy was structured properly or ideally, how things were functioning. And then with that, obviously, like, does something need to change? And when I started studying antitrust law, one of my first reactions was, this is deeply conservative. Like, this whole project of ensuring competition and limiting undue concentration of economic power, like, this is deeply rooted in fundamental conservative values. And then realized that I was the only person I knew that shared that view, and that the predominant perspective on the right had been, no, antitrust is government interference and regulation, micromanaging the economy, and stifling economic health. And I think, not just the last 15 years, but a much longer arc has shown that to not be the case. And I view that as one of my projects now to help illustrate why this is a deeply conservative project. But I don't want to act like this. When I say it's conservative, I mean it's consistent with the values that conservatives believe. It's certainly not anything limited to one party or another, and I don't think it has to be partisan or political. But it's valuable in and of itself. And so I think demonstrating that, and then looking at the challenges we face today. Back then it was a financial crisis. Since then, we've had more people on the right sort of wake up to this. And yeah, it started with the behavior of some large technology firms. But it's not limited to that. It was sort of a realization that, hey, giant concentrations of economic power can actually harm you in ways that the state likely has a role to redress. And so there's been a reconsideration, finally sort of a willingness to have an open mind and reconsider, have we been addressing these questions in the right way, or do we need to rethink them? And I think that's the big project of our time, and I'm happy to play a small part in it.
Definitely, and one of your main intellectual endeavors, and we can see it in your talk on the May 1st, like a few days ago, Antitrust Policy for the Conservative, and I invite everybody to read it. It's a 30-page speech where you can really see Mark's view on what antitrust policy is for the conservative. One of your main intellectual endeavors is to what you call decoupling kind of the libertarian view and the conservative view. It's true that over the years, and perhaps decades, there was a quite strong alignment between the libertarian view. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, and why it is so important today to have this decoupling between libertarian and conservative view, and also how can it build some bridges across the aisle and being non-bipartisan?
Yeah. So as I lay out in the paper, right, there was an alliance between conservatives and libertarians in the mid-20th century, and it was really about communism, right? We had a common enemy in socialism and communism, and truly drastic state interference. And so, conservatives and libertarians were aligned, like directionally aligned in fighting that common enemy, and it was very successful. It worked, right? And throughout all this, right, there's always been understanding that conservatives and libertarians have differences on social policy, right? Like, libertarians are the party of pot and porn and weird stuff, and conservatives have nice, wholesome families. It's a joke, mostly. But we'd forgotten that there's a difference between conservatives and libertarians on economic policy, right? When you go to the extreme of communism and socialism, it's easy to think, well, we're all on the same page. Like, that's bad. We all agree. But short of that, right, there's room for disagreement. And so, what I've encountered a lot is I will say something about, like, hey, this is what antitrust policy should look like, or how we should think about things. And someone will say, that's not conservative. I'm like, no, it's not libertarian. it doesn't mean it's not conservative, right? So there's
Distinction
a distinction
between
there.
free markets and open markets, perhaps.
Right. There's a, the conservatives view, this is where we kind of zoom out to political philosophy. The conservatives' view of freedom is really about ordered liberty. It's not libertinism. It's not the absence of any constraint. You have to have law and order. You have to have rules to have true freedom. And we believe that applies no less to the personal sphere than it does to markets, right? And so free markets are not self-perpetuating. They're not self-protecting. They require the rule of law to maintain them, and that includes the laws of fair competition.
You warn against the anarchistic private tyranny in your speech. Also, very interestingly, going back to innovation, and you mentioned in the speech again that innovation can be sometimes used and abused as a defense only, but we can flip that switch and look at also as an offense to innovation. Like, can there be those novel theories of harm where you use innovation as a potentially antitrust offense? And you warn in your speech, I mean, more generally, referring to Schumpeter, Gales of Creative Destruction, said that those days with perhaps big tech and AI or the way the economy has evolved, you warn against the perennial lull of creative destruction. Can you elaborate a bit? Why is it so important those days to potentially be aware of those perennial lull of creative destructions where large company can create this mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that can be a widely agreed upon view, which is that oftentimes the greatest innovations and the most beneficial to society are those that are not incremental within a legacy market. They change the marketplace, right? And when we refer to creative destruction, I think ideally that's what we're talking about, right? So smartphones kind of displacing desktop computers, right? We began doing things in an entirely new way we hadn't even considered. It wasn't just an increase in processor speed, right? So that type of innovation is truly transformative. And the irony is that the entities most often citing that in defense of the way they run their business are large entrenched incumbents. The entities most often actually doing it are two guys in a garage, right? That's where we usually get the transformative innovation, because those are the people that have the incentive to shake things up and change the marketplace. If you're already large and entrenched, you want to maintain the status quo for as long as you can.
You don't have an incentive to cannibalize on your own innovation. That's what you explained. Moving on your FTC and your tenure. So you confirmed just in April 2025 for a term through September 2031. So you have plenty of time to lay your mark at the FTC, and we're looking forward to that. So the FTC, it's fair to say, under the Biden administration was quite disruptive in the way they've done things. One area of activism was regulation, or at least the rulemaking authority the alleged rulemaking authority of the FTC. The other was the merger. They drove these merger guidelines, but the way they approach mergers. And we just heard from Chair Ferguson that those merger guidelines are going to be continued and approved. So is it fair to say that we can anticipate, is it fair to say just that the merger policy under the FTC will kind of have some continuation with what we've seen in the Biden, but on the rulemaking, there will be more of a pushback and going back to perhaps a more self-restrained view of the FTC's capabilities or authority on rulemaking? Is that the largest, beyond other aspects, but is that the largest, the biggest distinction with the Biden administration?
So yes and no. On the rulemaking side, I will point out, right, there are certain laws Congress has passed where they direct us to engage in some rulemaking in order to effectuate the purpose of that statute. On the antitrust side, yes, I think there's going to be a pullback, right? I think only speaking for myself, and I should have prefaced my remarks with that, by the way, that only for myself, not for the commission.
It goes without
the
saying.
Commissioner. Well, but then someone won't. But yeah, I think that we're all in agreement, right, that antitrust especially is better enforced on a case-by-case basis because those cases are so fact-specific. They very rarely lend themselves to sort of one-size-fits-all rules. So I think, yeah, there will be a difference there. On the merger enforcement policy, we are keeping the guidelines, which I think is the right thing to do. But I don't think that means there's going to be no changes. I think under the last administration, what we saw a lot of was the process as punishment, right? Throwing sand in the gears, trying to make it as hard as possible just to get into and through the HSR process. The idea being that if people never file their mergers, that's great. Chairman Ferguson has said this repeatedly, and I agree 100%, which is that we will vigorously enforce the law, and if your merger is anti-competitive, we will go to court to stop it. But if it's not, we're going to get out of the way, right? We're not here to just stop mergers for the sake of stopping mergers, right? We want to do our job. We want to act as law enforcers, which means looking at the law and the facts to determine whether there actually is a problem. Not every merger is bad. Many are good. Probably most are good. It's just that the ones we hear about the most tend to be the ones that are most concerning. And when that happens, we'll go after it. But we don't want to gum up the works and slow things down just for the sake of slowing down deal making across the board.
Right, that's what the previous administration was like, the reducing of the amount of deals being, like the reduction of this deal-making activity. So you have some years, 2041. What are the 2 or 3 priorities that you want to focus on and let your mark, given your philosophical conservative approach to antitrust, and how can we translate that into practice? What are the 2 or 3 priorities that you have for your tenure?
It's a great question. I think there's sort of one overarching project, which is, to take this sort of renewed, vigorous approach to antitrust and apply it to the facts, right, a case-by-case basis. And so keeping an eye out for situations where, we see conduct in the marketplace that we feel like clearly anti-competitive and harming consumers, but it may be difficult to win in court because the law has gotten this a little bit wrong in the past, and seeing if there aren't opportunities to identify those cases and maybe move the law in a better direction. We're not talking about radical transformation here, but I think there are some small changes that could probably be done that would move things in the right direction significantly. So that's one thing. I think, again, ending a lot of this sort of weaponization of the process, helping things to move slowly, to move smoothly, not slowly. We want the process to be smooth and not just slowing everything down. I think part of the problem of the last administration, they would say it was a good thing that we didn't have as many mergers being filed because that's more work to review them. Well, they were spending a lot of resources on things like rulemaking and other projects that took resources away from what could have been doing, facilitating a more efficient merger review process. So I think there's work to be done fixing that. Chairman Ferguson has done a lot of great work already to move us in a better direction. And then, on the other side of the FTC, which is consumer protection, very interested in what we can do to protect kids, especially with online platforms. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to figure out what else can be done and how we can protect them. It's something where there's a lot of agreement that there's a problem, and we just need to figure out what the best solution is.
Where there's no discussion about the rulemaking, actually, authority of the FTC on consumer protection side. So, well, thank you so much, Mark. I think we're right on time. That was a fantastic keynote and fantastic fireside chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.